It's Friday, December 20th, 2024. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, we were originally going to be talking about the future of health and human services, but the news had other plans this week, so I scrapped that show entirely, also the interview with that show, and we are going to be talking about the government shutdown fight that wasn't supposed to happen this time around, and Elon Musk cementing his place as the shadow president and maybe even Speaker of the House. But before we get to all that, let's first get to your headlines. On Monday, a 15-year-old student at a Christian school for all ages in Madison, Wisconsin, walked into her school and opened fire, killing a 42-year-old teacher and a 14-year-old student, wounding 6 other students. 2 of them are still in critical condition, all before taking her own life. Police have identified the shooter as Nicole Ruppnow, though she went by Samantha at school. Investigators say she was armed with 2 handguns, but they have not said how she got them in the first place. Now, it's still unclear what her motive was. And I know that there's some kind of manifesto that's been floating around on social media and online right now, but nobody has been able to verify if that's actually real, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Investigators also believe that Samantha was communicating with a 20-year-old man in California who was allegedly plotting an attack of his own at a government building on the West Coast where he planned to be armed with explosives and guns. A restraining order under California's red flag law was issued against that man by a judge. On Tuesday, Luigi Mangione, the man accused of shooting and killing the former United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, was indicted in New York on first-degree murder charges. Now, despite initially fighting extradition from Pennsylvania back to New York, he was flown back by NYPD and given a perp walk from the helipad, which is unusual. Normally, NYPD doesn't do that because there are concerns about tainting a jury pool for the trials by seeing somebody walked in a jumpsuit and handcuffs when they actually haven't been convicted yet. But the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, was at the helipad when Mangione landed, so that's also unusual, but it would explain the perp walk because Adams, A, loves the camera, and B, is involved in a corruption scandal of his own right now and needs the kind of good press that he got here. In a press conference just after that, he called the killing of Brian Thompson not just a murder, but terrorism. Now, he also was echoing what the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who brought the first-degree murder charge, also said in a press conference the day before. Mangione was also in federal court yesterday on Thursday when he was charged with murder there. Now, unlike New York, where the state has abolished the death penalty, Mangione could be facing the death penalty in the federal case. On Wednesday, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates by 1/4 point, which, like I've said when I've talked about these before, doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about billions of dollars of interest or billions of dollars going to companies or entire economies, it is a lot. But that wasn't the real news from these lower rates. It's what the Fed said about the future of these rates. It said it would be looking at slowing down these rate cuts, which have been happening since the summer for steadily months now. And they said they were going to be slowing things down because they were worried about inflation rising again under a Trump presidency, which it is expected to do under his tax plan. Now, that sent the stock market tumbling on Wednesday. The Nasdaq, which is a collection of stocks, had its worst day since July. The Dow Jones, another stock index, fell 1,100 points, which is a lot. And it was its 10th straight day of dropping, something that the Dow Jones has not done since 1974. So this isn't great news for the end of the year, for companies trying to plan out the beginning of 2025 or their next quarters, but it is seen as a sign of things that might be coming next year. And finally, on Thursday, the Georgia Court of Appeals disqualified the district attorney who is overseeing the election interference case against Donald Trump and 8 others, effectively ending the case. Earlier this year, the Superior Court, which is what they call courts in Georgia, it's kind of a weird system, but that's what they call them. This was the Superior Court in Fulton County. A judge there found that DA Fani Willis and her former co-counsel, who had dated each other in the past, one of them needed to resign to keep the case from being dismissed. Right after that ruling from that judge, her co-counsel resigned. However, Trump's attorneys appealed that decision, saying they should have both been disqualified, and the appeals court agreed. Now, legal experts say this ruling is sort of on some shaky ground here and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but the case isn't technically over. The appellate judge didn't dismiss these charges, and Willis said she's not done. She's already saying that she'll be appealing the ruling to the Georgia Supreme Court, to the next highest court. But what all of this does mean is that likely none of this will get decided until Trump is officially president, which could also hamper yet another case where the public could get some kind of closure, some kind of legal answer to the things that we saw and heard Trump do in 2020 to try and undermine the election. Okay, I know those weren't the most uplifting of headlines, but it's been one of those weeks. And I hate to say it, but our main topic this week isn't much better. The looming government shutdown and what we're learning about who's really pulling the strings in the Republican Party right now. So, for those of you who listened to the midweek episode, the second half was all about this looming government shutdown. But I said that it was likely that members would grumble but go along with it because nobody wanted the government to shut down and nobody wanted to be at work over Christmas. That deal meant that the government would stay funded at its current level until March 14th, disaster relief would get $100 billion, farmers would get relief from high costs, and the debt limit would be raised, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. Well, that was undone almost the second I got the episode up because Donald Trump, and more importantly here, Elon Musk, called for the deal to fund the government until March to be killed, and it was. Now, the same thing could happen again here, and it might have already happened. I'm recording this on Thursday afternoon, and Republicans have just said that they might have a deal that would fund the government until March. It would suspend the debt limit for another 2 years. It would give disaster and farm aid some relief. It would also extend some healthcare spending, but also cut out about $190 million that was meant to go to children's cancer research that just 2 days ago, from when I'm recording this, one of the groups behind getting that funding through was celebrating that funding. But as of right now, a vote hasn't been taken on this new funding package, and it is not looking good. But no matter what happens with that vote, what matters here is what Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and the Republicans were willing to risk. And most importantly, what we're learning about just how prominent of a feature Musk is going to be in all of our lives in the next 4 years. So here's what Musk said on X, formerly Twitter, about the original funding bill, saying simply, this bill should not pass. But later, he went further, threatening members of the GOP who were going to vote for it, saying in another post, any member of the House or Senate who votes for this outrageous spending bill deserves to be voted out in 2 years. And while that might not seem like a regular threat, it's a political one, and every Republican who saw that post, and that was most of them, if not all of them by now, knew two very important things. First, Elon Musk is the richest person to have ever lived, worth now more than $400 billion. Second, he was more than willing to drop $250 million, more than $250 million, to get Donald Trump elected in just the final 6 weeks or so of the election, and it would not cost him anything in those terms to fund, let's say, a congressional challenger to oust them next election. So after Musk posted that, Trump, and I guess J.D. Vance was attached to this too, in sort of a, hey guys, I'm still here kind of a way, they put out a statement on X as well that said the bill shouldn't pass. Trump's big sticking point here was the debt ceiling or the debt limit. And let's start there. So the debt limit or the debt ceiling isn't really what it sounds like. It's the limit set by Congress on how much the federal government can borrow, and raising it just lets the government pay back the debts that it already owes. It doesn't necessarily create new debt. The reason the debt limit exists at all is because of World War I. So spending in 1917 was starting to increase, and with the war on, there was just not a lot of time for the executive branch to come back to Congress every time they needed a little bit more money. Congress controls the purse strings of the government, and so that's how things have been working up until that point. And before 1917, the U.S. just didn't have the same spending needs and also had about a quarter of the population it has now and only had 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska weren't even states yet. But as we got more involved in World War I and World War II, it became bigger global traders, our population grew, we became a global power. We needed to spend more both here and on what we were doing abroad. And that's kind of how we got into some of this. But that new debt that exists, economists agree, comes almost entirely from interest costs and inflation, not from us actually spending more. And it's worth pointing out two things here too. So first, the government spending, it's not like spending on your credit card or out of your checking account or even like a business or corporate account. They're just not the same thing. They don't operate the same way. And the amount of money that's legally required to be spent is required. It's mandatory when it comes to the government or people get hurt. And I'll go into more of that here in just a minute. The second thing is that when the U.S. borrows money from, say, another country in the form of bonds or securities, no country believes that the U.S. won't make good on that debt at some point, and no country will risk calling in that debt on the U.S. because it would collapse the global economy, harming them too, like a mutually assured destruction of economics, which is what would happen if the U.S. doesn't raise the debt ceiling, or as the U.S. Treasury puts it, failing to increase the debt limit would have catastrophic economic consequences, and that would precipitate another financial crisis and threaten the jobs and savings of everyday Americans, putting the United States right back in a deep economic hole. And I know that sounds alarming, and that's from the U.S. Treasury, and these are people who are not often alarmed, let's say. So Trump has called for an end to the debt ceiling altogether. Go back to what things were like before 1917. The debt ceiling for the past 2 years had actually been suspended so that Congress and the federal government could do some more spending on COVID relief to help us dig out of that hole a little more. But it was expected to be put back into place next month. Now, Trump has called to end the debt ceiling before. This is what he said back in 2017.
But certainly we will extend on the debt ceiling because they understand the importance of debt ceiling. That's really a sacred trust.
Do you want to get rid of that vote process entirely, Mr. President?
Well, I think that, it could be discussed. For many years, people have been talking about getting rid of debt ceiling altogether, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that. So certainly that's something that will be discussed. We even discussed it at the meeting that we had yesterday. It complicates things. It's really not necessary because you're talking about budget, so it's really not necessary. But it's certainly something we could discuss. But as long as it's there, it will never be violated.
I should say here that the only time Trump calls for an end to the debt ceiling is when he's in or about to be in power. He has also previously called for the U.S. to default on its debt, to send the global economy spiraling when Democrats have been in power, something he called for just a few months ago when we did this whole song and dance about whether or not the government was going to shut down or not back in September. Now, some Democrats have actually come out and agreed with Trump about getting rid of the debt ceiling, like liberal Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who posted on X, Congress should terminate the debt limit and never again govern by hostage taking. And right now, the idea of getting rid of the debt ceiling is on thin ice with several Republicans who will be crucial to getting the government funded as I'm recording. But the threat of a government shutdown is, I would argue, already governing by hostage taking, by holding millions of Americans hostage. The longest and most recent shutdown was back in 2018, right about this time of year, over into 2019. It was 35 days long. There were also shutdowns in 1996 and 2013. Now, Republicans and Elon Musk are calling for the government to be shut down for 33 days this time, which would bring us to Inauguration Day. Musk posting on X, yes, in all caps, in a reply to a meme account called Wall Street Mav that said, defund everything, we will be fine for 33 days. But the thing is, that just isn't true. A lot of people will not be fine. You see, when the government shuts down, the results are frankly nothing short of catastrophic. It's not just images that we see of U.S. monuments or national parks closing down, although estimates from the last time this happened was about $500 million in lost revenue to those parks. But it's also the lives of millions of government workers, civil servants, and members of the military that are impacted here. For starters, nearly 1 million federal workers will be furloughed or won't get paid to come to work. In 2018, 380,000 workers were sent home without pay for the entire 5 weeks, and another 420,000 still had to go to work without pay. Some 14,000 never showed up to work because they didn't want to show up to work when they weren't getting paid. Because those workers were sent home, that meant that vital services in the government and in agencies were interrupted, like at the IRS, where 1.2 million income and Social Security confirmations were backlogged, meaning billions of dollars in mortgage and loan approvals went unapproved, for people's homes and businesses and livelihoods. And there were billions of dollars in tax returns that didn't go out. Or over at the Department of Health and Human Services, where people who were waiting for medical grants to be approved to do critical medical research, or people who were waiting to be admitted as patients to sometimes get crucial care, or do things like baby formula, all had to get put on hold. Or how about over the FDA and the EPA, where in past shutdowns, they had to stop the inspection of more than 1,200 hazardous waste chemical facilities or drinking water plants, or stop the inspection of 900 food processing facilities, that make sure that we can eat safely. And speaking of eating, then there are the impacts on people who use government services, like the people on food stamps, or what it's formerly known as the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP. In 2019, a study looked at the impacts of the shutdown on SNAP recipients and found that while some were given their next month's check of benefits in advance to hopefully stave off the worst effects of a 5-week-long shutdown, a lot of them didn't get those checks, and for a lot who did get them, there was a lot of confusion and fear about why they were receiving 2 checks and if they could spend that money. Now, for a long time, SNAP benefits have been described as subpar, not giving families enough to buy healthy food or even enough food, which is for a different episode here, but what that study ended up finding was, quote, the inadequacy of SNAP benefits to meet participants' food needs were intensified by the shutdown. What they're really saying there is people went hungry. And I'm not done yet, so stick with me. A government shutdown also affects the more than 2.1 million military members who won't get paid. During the last shutdown, experts pointed to challenges for young military families and to long-term readiness for the overall military because, as one expert put it, quote, folks are not getting paychecks. It impacts how and when they can buy groceries, childcare, all of these things. And that goes for regular government workers too, like one woman who told the BBC during the 2018 shutdown, who, because she wasn't getting paid, was afraid she wouldn't be able to afford her vital antidepressant medication, so she had to resort to rationing it by cutting it into quarters. That woman also said she used her furlough time to look for other jobs. And experts also say that while a shutdown alone won't cause government workers to leave on its own, it certainly won't help them stay. As one expert from Florida International University said, it will make them more likely to leave, and while it may feed Republican goals, it harms millions of Americans. And I do want to say, when shutdowns happen, usually there is back pay for some of those government employees. But it is the trying to figure out how they're going to spend their money over a month in which they're not getting paid. And things, especially this time of year on the holidays, are incredibly tight for so many people. The people who don't get paid back are people like contractors or subcontractors who work for the government, who do things that we rely on, like data services. And all of that is the reality of a shutdown on a personal level. And then there's the macro level too. After the last 35-day shutdown, the U.S. economy shrunk by $18 billion and never recovered. That's according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. That is investment, revenue, profit, and taxes that disappeared because Congress couldn't get its act together. And I know that I have talked about this before, but I'm going to do it every single time that we have one of these shutdown fights, because it is just not good enough to talk about this thing in the abstract, because we have to point to the abject cruelty that's required to use the lives of American people as political pawns. But none of that seems to be of consequence to Elon Musk, which is what I want to turn to now. So no matter what happens or what has already happened with the shutdown fight, we got a serious glimpse into just how much power Elon Musk has over Donald Trump and the GOP. Now, since the election, there's been a decent amount of reporting about just how close Musk is to Trump, essentially spending every day since the election at Mar-a-Lago and even wearing out his welcome a little bit with some staffers. But this fight is something different than a billionaire hanging around a golf resort. Elon Musk said jump, and Republicans said how high, a role that previously had been filled and reserved by and for Donald Trump. And it's now unclear who's going to fill that role going forward, so much so that a Trump spokesperson had to put out a statement saying that Trump was still in charge of the Republican Party, which, not a great look for a guy who has yet to take the oath of office. Although that is part of the line that Democrats have been using for the last 24 hours or so. It's that Trump gave up his presidency to Elon Musk. Here's Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts saying just that.
The government done because of the words of an eccentric, weird gazillionaire who basically instructed him to do that. I think it's a terrible thing.
What do you think Musk's de facto role in the policy?
Well, I think he's president and Trump is now vice president. I think that's clear.
And
we'll come back to McGovern a little later. He's got some other choice words for some other leaders, but there is just no way that and things like that aren't getting under Trump's skin. And it's not just Trump who has been a casualty of Musk sticking his nose into politics here. It's also Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, whose days as Speaker are very numbered. Several members of the Republican Party have already turned against him for putting up the original government funding bill, like far-right Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky, who told CNN it would take a Christmas miracle for him to vote for Johnson as Speaker again, and there were a lot more non-committal or no Republican votes swirling around as well. And remember, Johnson only became Speaker after agreeing to give any single member of his party the ability to call for a vote to kick him out of his job whenever they felt like it. And he is one of the smallest majorities right now in history. So Johnson could try to get support from Democrats, which he's done before, to try to stay in power. But when the leader of the Democrats in the House, Representative from New York, Hakeem Jeffries, was asked about it, this was his answer.
Mr. Leader.
Thank you, sir. If Mike Johnson puts out something that's amiable to Democrats, he may face a revolt in the House Republican conference on the speakership vote on January 3rd. Would Democrats consider voting for him in that vote if he does something amiable to you with the CR?
No. Mr. Leader.
And that is about as blunt as it gets, except for when you hear Representative McGovern again, who had some different words for Johnson. And just a word of warning, there's some adult language here.
I said this yesterday, I said it again today. I wish Speaker Johnson would throw a fucking spine because this is pathetic.
So that is Mike Johnson's life right now. He knows he's at the whim of his party. He knows the people across the aisle aren't going to help him out. And he knows that his own party and maybe his own president are taking direction from a South African-born billionaire. And it also seems like he might be taking a little direction from Elon Musk, too. Here he is admitting to calling Musk after Musk took to Twitter to kill the original funding bill.
And this is breaking news you do not know. You know who also does not like this? Elon Musk, the world's richest man, just tweeted, this bill should not pass. The only way you're going to be able to pass it now, Mr. Speaker, is with Democrats. If you could, what's your message to Elon Musk?
Well, I was communicating with Elon last night. Elon and Vivek and I are on a text chain together. And I was explaining to them the background of this. And Vivek and I talked last night about almost midnight. And he said, look, I get it. He said, we understand you're in an impossible position. Everybody knows that. Remember, guys, we still have just a razor-thin margin of Republicans. So any bill has to have Democrat votes. They understand the situation. They said, it's not directed to you, Mr. Speaker, but we don't like the spending. I said, guess what, fellas? I don't either. We got to get this done because here's the key. By doing this, we are clearing the decks and we are setting up for Trump to come in roaring back with the America First agenda. That's what we're going to run with gusto beginning January 3rd.
So first of all here, Vivek is Vivek Ramaswamy, the former Trump primary challenger turned bootlicker who is supposedly co-running Musk and Trump's imaginary Department of Government Efficiency alongside Musk. Second, not a good look for the guy who is the third most powerful person in the country to have to call the world's richest man to explain to him why he shouldn't try and get him fired. Third, it is also deeply, deeply weird and frankly troubling that the Speaker of the House has a text chain with two billionaire civilians where he discusses sensitive government deals and that he feels comfortable talking about that publicly. Now, some conservatives are asking if Musk has too much power, but many, many more are not. Here's how Congressman Andy Barr from Kentucky answered that question on Fox Business.
Does Musk have too much influence?
No, I don't think so. I think this is exactly what the American people voted for when they voted for Donald Trump. They voted for competency. They voted for innovative thinking. And certainly in Elon Musk, and Vivek Ramaswamy, we have a very bright light who believes in bringing some business principles and innovation and efficiencies to government. Thank goodness for that. We have a $36 trillion national debt. And so when our phones were ringing off the hook, our constituents were telling us, members of Congress, hey, this CR, this bloated CR with all of this extraneous spending that's not paid for, that's not what we voted for. We voted to implement government efficiency measures like those that Elon Musk is advocating for. So not too.
The thing is, no one elected Elon Musk, and no one was voting for Musk to be calling the shots this way, but he might end up doing just that in a very official capacity if several Republicans get their way, because no sooner than the funding bill was killed, Republicans started to call for Elon Musk to be the new Speaker of the House, because technically the Speaker doesn't have to be an elected official, they just always have been. Senator Rand Paul was the first, and then he was backed by others in the House, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some of his fellow senators, like Utah Senator Mike Lee, who went on a podcast and explained how it would work.
Look, the Doge movement is enormously popular in the House. Just listen to House members who are Republicans. They can't get enough of them, including many of the people who have been part of this swampy process. They praise Doge. Oh, Doge is going to save this. If that's the case, that being the case, given that they all have expressed such affection for Vivek and for Elon, let them choose one of them. I don't care which one to be their speaker. That would revolutionize everything. It would break up the firm. We would now have government of the people, by the people, and for the people, rather than this cartel from the firm, which is systemically corrupt.
So again, having Musk, who no one elected, or Ramaswamy, who lost his election, to be the Speaker of the House, the number 3 in line behind the president and vice president, would not be a government by the people for the people. It would be our leaders who are supposed to have our interests at heart, giving the reins over to an entire government body, to a man in Elon Musk who is hopelessly tangled in government contracts and regulation and oversight, who has no government experience and has enough money to essentially buy votes on the House floor by promising to fund campaigns or threatening to fund opponents. And that's what's really happening here. For all the fun that Democrats are having calling Musk the shadow president or Republicans daydreaming of a mean stock Speaker of the House, what we're seeing is the richest man in the world turn the U.S. government into his own personal sandbox in real time, and the fallout from that cannot be good. Okay, that is it for today's episode. This is also the last episode for the year. I'm taking the next 2 weeks off, although that's the plan, and I'm sure there will be a MIMS Mini in the near future, depending on what happens with a government shutdown or not. But for now, I just want to thank all of you who listened this year. You really made a difference and helped this show grow, and I've got a lot more coming in 2025, so I hope you stick around. So please rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. If you haven't done it already, like and subscribe and sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where, like I said before, I'll have a lot more coming in the new year on that platform, but a lot of it is going to be behind a paywall, so you're not going to want to miss out on any of those things. Like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos. Also, continue to share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter, or X, and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus, Happy New Year, whatever you celebrate. I hope you and your families have a good one. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next year.